Good evening. My name is Jamie Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of Temple Israel Great Neck. Thank you for joining us this evening for a conversation with Dr. Daniel Griffin, moderated by Temple Israel member and pediatrician, Dr. Laura Gal. This program is hosted by Temple Israel, and we give special thanks for the collaboration and communication by Temple Beth El Great Neck, the Great Neck Chinese Association, and the Sephardic Heritage Alliance. And of course, I can't thank Drs. Griffin and Gal enough for lending their time this evening and all that they do for the communities in which they serve. The format for tonight will be a presentation by Dr. Griffin, followed by a Q&A. Many of you sent questions in with your registration, and these will be answered first. If there is still time, the doctors may pull inquiries from the Q&A feature located on the screen. You'll see that there's a small Q&A button on the bottom if you're using a PC or laptop. It might be on the top if you're using an iPad. You would just click that, and if you type in a question, the panelists will see that. Lastly, we all know that there is no secret method of securing a vaccine. It's a combination of computer savvy and patience. If you or someone you know needs computer assistance and is currently eligible to receive the vaccine, please contact me after the meeting, email me, reply to the email registration that we heard that you received the links with, and we will do our best to pair you with a volunteer to help. They can't guarantee, and it could take some time, but we do have some volunteers at our disposal. Without further ado, thank you so much. Enjoy the presentation and good health to everyone.
Hi, I'm Laura Gal, and I am honored tonight to introduce Dr. Dan Griffin. He is Chief of the Division of Infectious Disease at ProHealth and a Senior Fellow for United Health Group for Infectious Disease. He is also an instructor of clinical medicine at Columbia University. He is a physician scientist with expertise in global health and tropical medicine, parasitology, and virology, specifically now the SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, as you know it. He is internationally invited to speak. He has spoken at the University of Glasgow, the Peace Corps, the University of Minnesota, the Foundation for International Medical Relief of Children, Floating Doctors, Remote Care Education, as well as other groups in Asia, Caribbean, Central America, Africa, and India. And we are pleased to have him here tonight. Dan?
Hello. Thank you for the introduction. And I think Jamie's going to be driving slides for us tonight. Just to give people a little bit of an overview. It's only going to be about 20 slides, so it's not going to be slide heavy, because what I want to do is I want to leave plenty of time for questions. A lot of people have a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to create a framework, and then we'll talk a little bit, we'll address all the different questions, and hopefully I'll be able to stay long enough to get them all addressed. So we're going to be talking about COVID-19, no surprise. We're going to talk about the phases, the timing of therapeutics, but we're really going to have a big focus on immunization. So next slide. One of the things that I really want to get across is that timing matters. This isn't a mix and match with COVID-19. So there's a whole sort of progression of the disease that I want to go through, because when you do certain things matter. So let's talk about I'm going to say about the 7 different stages here. So the first is what hopefully most of our audience is in, is the pre-exposure. No one's been exposed yet to COVID-19, to actually SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. And there's a lot of things we've talked about, right? It took a while before masks were embraced, and now we're hearing that maybe we want to wear 2 masks, make sure they're tightly fitting. Also talking about trying to avoid areas where there are larger groups indoors. We've come to realize that even though this is primarily a droplet respiratory large particle spread, if you get a bunch of people indoors for a while, you start to get enough of it in the air that actually you can have spread even if you're more than those 6 feet away. We probably did a lot more than we needed to with all the what we call hygiene theater, all the bleaching and wiping down, and but we still recommend about 10% of it can be spread through surface contact, so we still want to do that. We're also going to talk about this pre-exposure point. This is when hopefully we're going to be talking about vaccines. The next thing we'll get into is once you've been unfortunately exposed and you're starting to get the virus replicating, what can we do at that point? This often comes right before symptoms, right before symptom onset, before you even start feeling bad. And that's been a real challenge for us because the virus may be at a high point even before you start having symptoms. And interesting enough, this sort of, I talked to my wife about this, before you're coughing, before you're sneezing, you have very high levels of virus, but you're not coughing, you're not sneezing. But speaking actually is more effective way of spreading than a cough or a sneeze. Just because a cough or a sneeze is an intermittent event. Talking, singing, you're just spraying out a constant amount of the virus. But then after the symptoms, people feel crummy for about a week. And then we have that early inflammatory phase that we'll talk about where people might end up in the hospital, a later period where people might get other infections, a second surge of inflammation. We saw this initially quite dramatically in young children. And then we're learning more about people not necessarily getting all better. Maybe 10% of folks, even not ending up in the hospital, continue to suffer down the road. So we'll hit on that just a little, but next slide. But I want to focus on each little bit. So as I mentioned, the pre-exposure period, if you are potentially going to be exposed, you want to be in the best shape you can be. A lot of people have neglected their health, put on a little bit of what we call the pandemic pounds. They maybe haven't visited the doctor for those scheduled visits, but you want to do those things. You want to try to exercise when you can in a safe way. A little tricky with the icy roads and icy sidewalks, but getting out for walks, trying to make sure you get that exercise when you can, trying to not overeat. A lot of us are locked in our homes. We're not having those usual social interactions and other interactions we enjoy. A little bit more eating is going on, but trying to sort of maintain that optimal health. No reason to be vitamin D or any other vitamin deficient going into this. The other, as I mentioned, these mitigation strategies, trying to keep that distance, trying to keep the crowd sizes small, wearing those masks. I think it took a long time to embrace it, but as mentioned, we're now starting to talk about maybe more than one mask. Make sure they fit properly. And I always like to point out, there are 3 holes in the front of your face. There's the mouth, the 2 nares. If you're only covering one of those holes, you're missing, you're missing 2/3. So you really want to do that. And another really big thing, right? I don't know if people have heard, the governor's talking about opening up stadiums to sporting activities, having people in these stadiums, not at full capacity, but one of the things he's going to throw in is testing. I've been involved with the NHL. I'm the infectious disease expert for the Islanders. Testing was really a critical part of making that happen safely, making sure you don't introduce people into those settings. Now, if there is spread at those big events, I want to point out, testing doesn't predict the future. If you had a test now and 3 days from now, could you have the virus? Definitely. Not every test is 100% too. So it's all these things, putting them together, many, many layers, trying to get us in better shape. But really, what are the big things that are going to get us out of this pandemic? What are the things that actually look like they save lives? That's going to be our active and passive vaccination. And that's what I'm mainly going to talk about tonight. So next slide. So as I talked about, when do you want to get those vaccines? When do you want to have immunity? You want to have immunity before you're exposed. And this slide here kind of goes through all these different stages. There's a hopefully very long period prior to the time you're exposed. Once a person is exposed, it takes a while before that virus really ramps up. And if you do get sick, that could be a period of as short as a day or 2 out to 14 days. That's what my wife likes to say is an excessive period of quarantine when you're not sure if you're going to get sick. Once you do get sick, then we move into that period of isolation where the virus goes up. And for most people, it's about 10 days that we're having people isolate while they have this infectious level of virus. Some of the people end up in the hospital. Actually, that virus can stay up a little bit longer, might be 20 days before it's safe for those people to interact. Next slide. But let's talk about vaccines. Vaccines, and I have to say the vaccines that have come out so far have really changed our expectations for what vaccines might do. And there are 4 major types of vaccines. Some of this technology is new to us, new to, I think, the general public. But I do want to point out that we've been working on all these technologies for decades now. So a lot of, we talked about Operation Warp Speed. Are we rushing? Well, we've actually put about 20 years, 2 decades of work into all of these, some of them even longer. But I'm going to go through each different type of vaccine, give everyone kind of a sense of what that vaccine is supposed to be doing, and then also use that as a stepping off point to talk about these monoclonal antibody therapies, which are out there, underutilized, pretty dramatic. So we're going to be talking about the traditional, I'm going to say whole virus vaccines, the viral vector vaccines, these new nucleic acid vaccines, new to people, been used in the veterinary realm for many years now, and then the protein-based vaccines. So just a little bit of immunology to start. So next slide. So what are we doing? And this is just quick. Don't worry. Don't be overwhelmed. Just enjoy the pretty art. What we're trying to do is we're trying to teach the body, the immune system, to recognize this spike protein. And in this cartoon, the spike protein are these little red cartoony things, almost like golf tees, right? Sticking off the surface of the virus. And we want our B cells to learn about these so our B cells can make those antibodies. You probably heard about, oh, I'm going to get my titers checked to make sure that I have immunity to something. We also want to teach our T cells. Our T cells actually can look at the sequence of the protein, and then they can actually recognize and help us fight this. So we got our B cells, our T cells, we want to educate them. Now, how do we do this? Next slide. So going back, right, maybe actually people listening remember Sabin Sundays, right? This is the origin of that song, A Spoonful of Sugar Makes the Medicine Go Down. There were these events, a lot of them were in school gymnasiums. They were at sort of community centers where the population on a weekend, Sunday, would actually go and they would get this little sugar cube, and it was pink because the oral polio vaccine was on there. What they had done in this situation is they had passed that virus until it was a little bit weaker. And then that virus would then allow us to see, our immune system see what needs to be recognized, but the virus was somewhat crippled so that it would not make a person sick, or I should say a very low risk of making a person sick. The inactivated is you basically grow up a whole bunch of that virus, and then you use something like formaldehyde to inactivate it, and then you give a person a whole bunch of that. And that was the injected polio Salk vaccine, right? So these are vaccines that go back many decades, right? These are the vaccines that helped us end the polio epidemic in the United States. And I used to live in Colorado, and when I was actually applying to the University of Colorado School of Medicine, I didn't go there. I went to NYU in good old New York City in the Lower East Side. But they actually told the story about how frightened people were with the polio epidemic, with all the paralysis and the iron lungs. There was actually, for a period of time, there was a Klan governor of Colorado. Pandemics can really frighten people, and we can see some bad behavior. And how did we get out of the polio epidemic? Vaccines. So these are sort of these old-fashioned, grow up a bunch of the virus, let it get a little bit weaker, let people see it, or you actually somehow inactivate. Now, we're not going to talk too much more about these in the realm of COVID. These are being tested, not quite as impressive as some of our other vaccines. So next slide. Now these, just to give people context, this is the technology that underlies the AstraZeneca or the Oxford vaccine and the JNJ vaccine. Basically what they're doing is they're taking a common cold virus, they're modifying it, so on its surface is this spike protein. The little bit of subtle difference is the JNJ vaccine takes that spike protein, it sort of fixes it in a special conformation that we think is better for immunity. The AstraZeneca didn't do that. So far, we're seeing results suggesting that may have been a good idea. The J&J, which is going to get reviewed by the FDA on the 26th of this month, is a single shot virus, single shot vaccine. There's no virus in there. You can't get the virus from the vaccine. It's just this modified adenovirus vector that they're using. By 7 weeks, 100% protection against death. AstraZeneca, and I think this is something we're going to see as we talk. If your benchmark is, I want to get something that will keep me from dying of COVID, all the vaccines you're going to hear are 100% effective in that. Are they as good? Are they all reaching this 95%? I won't get any symptoms at all. Not quite there, and actually definitely not quite there against some of the new variants that we're hearing about around the globe. So these types of vaccines, the J&J is a single shot. The AstraZeneca is a double shot. As we get into the mRNA vaccines, one of the comments I'll make is these have very little reactogenicity. You get one of these shots, it's like getting the flu shot. Hardly notice you got it in most cases. All right, next slide. the nucleic acid vaccines. This was actually really impressive technology. We've been using these vaccines for quite a while. There's a West Nile virus vaccine for horses. There are several poultry vaccines. The DNA vaccines we've been sort of looking at for a while, and I'll say the RNA vaccines we've been working on for about 2 decades, about 20 years. One of the problems with the RNA vaccines is they're not cheap, they're expensive. So trying to come in and say, oh, there's a $3, a $10 flu shot, but now I've got a $100 flu shot that I think is even better. Not much of a market there. So these were sort of stagnating. They were looking at maybe treating other things. When COVID came on the scene, it actually only took a matter of weeks to get the sequence of the virus, make up the first mRNA vaccine, actually it was Moderna, and then ramp up and get it through testing. These vaccines, actually, how do they work? The RNA is actually really the blueprint, sort of a sticky note on how to make the protein. Your body does all the work. This RNA gets just into the cytoplasm, not into the center of a cell, but just into the liquid part of the cell. The protein is produced, and then your B cells can see it, your T cells can see it. They become educated. After about 48 hours, the sticky note is crumpled up, thrown away. And then 3 or 4 weeks later, you get kind of a reminder. You know, it's sort of like teaching someone something. You know, the first time they remember it, second time you really get it in there. Much better antibody reactions. These have been really phenomenal. 100% you get this so far. No one who's been vaccinated dies of COVID. 95%, 94, 95%, you don't even get symptoms if you're exposed to COVID. Pretty impressive. We're hoping that this also translates into you can't spread it to others. So that'll be an issue we'll talk about a little bit later. But one of the things we have found when people get these vaccines, first time you feel a little tired, you feel a little crummy. Second time people feel a little more tired, a little bit of crummy, maybe headache. So the reactogenicity seems to be more significant with these vaccines than traditional ones. Next slide. Now, the protein-based vaccines, maybe some of our listeners got the new improved shingle shot. And this is really, you just go right to the end game. You say, you know what my body needs to see to learn how to protect itself is the protein. Why don't I just give the protein? And that's what Novavax has been doing, really just like the new improved shingles vaccine. They take the protein, they sort of create, almost looks like a flower, right? And so the protein is stuck out. The body says it looks like a virus, sort of a round ball with these proteins. And this allows our B cells, our T cells to learn. And actually the reactogenicity, the soreness here is very similar, we anticipate, as the flu, as the new improved shingles shot. We're just getting preliminary data about the Novavax. It's not quite ready to go to the FDA, but so far it's looking good. Next slide. So let's just sum all this up here. We've got some people working on the whole virus vaccines out there. But here in the US, what options do we have right now? On the bottom left, we have the Moderna and the Pfizer, which are using the mRNA technology, basically giving you instructions. Your body makes a response. We have a couple viral vector vaccines getting ready for use in the US. We expect later this month for the JNJ to get approved. Still waiting on the AstraZeneca to really get all their ducks in a row and present that data. And we have the Novavax working on the protein-based vaccines. Before we jump ahead, I just want to give people a little bit of, I'll say, encouraging news. Right now, the vaccine rollout is going very slowly, painfully slowly. I was on a call this weekend with Andy Slavitt, who's the head of logistics for Biden's task force. We are anticipating within the next 4 to 8 weeks, going from a limited supply of vaccines that everyone is trying to chase down to having so many vaccines that the vaccines are actually looking for people. So vaccines chasing people down the road. Next slide. But the next thing I want to do, and I feel like this is really important because I do feel like this is a therapy that is underutilized. So we talked all about how we can show your body the protein. The B cells can make these wonderful antibodies. With Pfizer, you get your first shot. 3 weeks later, you get your second shot. And then 2 weeks later, you've got this nice high level of antibodies. So 5 weeks to get a nice high level of antibodies. Moderna, 4 + 2, 6 weeks. As I mentioned with the J&J, it looks like 7 weeks. Body's working hard trying to make all these antibodies. We now have the ability in as little as 16 minutes, put an IV in, and give you all those neutralizing antibodies that you need to protect you. So a couple companies have jumped in on this, and I've been working with Regeneron and Eli Lilly since early April. I don't know if we have anyone listening who is familiar with Prolia, denosumab, the osteoporosis medication. I developed that back in the 90s. So I was part of a team at Amgen. My wife always corrects me. There were 8 of us in the room. It wasn't all me. But when people started looking at antibody therapies in COVID, I got involved with Regeneron first and Eli Lilly later, talking about timing. Again, this is like a vaccine. You want to have this in right up front. You want to have it in early. You don't want to wait till after the fact, till the virus is already gone, when the secondary infections are occurring. This is a really potentially effective antiviral medication, therapeutic, and it's these antibodies. So let's go to the next slide. What are we talking about here? So we want to get this in during that early phase, either during the incubation phase or right when you start to get that detectable viral replication period. This is a therapy that critically needs to be given within the first 7 to 10 days from symptom onset or your first positive test. You don't wait to get sick. You don't watch and say, let's see how you do. The sooner you give it, the better. If you wait till after 10 days, it actually does more harm than good. So the window not only closes, but swings the other direction. So this is one of those, if you're 65 and over and you are diagnosed with COVID, you have about a 10% chance or higher of ending up in the hospital. People end up in the hospital, do not always do well. If you're 55 and over, but you have other medical problems or you just have serious medical problems in general, this might be a therapy for you. But again, it's going to have to be given very early. So next slide. So this is what these therapies are. You're giving people antibodies. Up until Tuesday, it was a 1-hour infusion. We just got approval from the FDA to shorten that to 16 minutes, at least for the Eli Lilly products. People have probably heard of Bam or bamlanivimab. And we're giving people these antibodies or immunoglobulins. It's the same thing, just fancy word. Next slide. There's a whole bunch of different types of antibodies. You first see something, you make the IgM, time goes by, you make the IgG, but we don't care about types of antibodies. What we care about, next slide, is this sticky little end of the antibody. And I don't know if people remember, there was a President Nixon, right? I think he was very into antibodies. He would put up his fingers and talk about antibodies and shake his jowls. Nixon, followed by Ford. If you think of an antibody as the peace sign, or maybe a slingshot is even better. But if you put up your fingers in that Y shape, your fingernails are these sticky ends, which it's really complicated how this works, but these sticky ends are incredibly specific and incredibly sticky. Your body can basically make these, and we're going to talk about how we can actually make them and give them to other people. So next slide. There's a whole sort of mix and match of different genetic elements that go together. Your body has the ability to make over 100 trillion different antibodies, so it can make exactly the right antibody to get the work done. This seems like a lot of work. How do we find that 1 in 100 trillion antibody that we really want? So next slide. Fortunately, we don't have to do all the work. We can get someone else to do it. The first monoclonal antibody, so bamlanivimab, was actually donor 45. It was an individual, got infected with COVID, and they actually isolated the B cells from this individual, and they are cloning them up. And that's what they're sharing with everyone when they give them the infusion of bamlanivimab. Another approach is there actually is what we call the $120 million mouse. And that is the price if you want to buy a breeding pair. And this is a mouse that has been modified to have that immunoglobulin genetic sequence of a human being. So you basically can expose them to that spike protein and then get them to make that perfect antibody for you. Next slide. You go ahead. In the olden days, we used to take those isolated B cells, making the right antibodies. We'd fuse them with a myeloma cell, immortalize it, and it would just pump out antibodies for us. Now we're a little bit more advanced. We actually isolate a single cell We then extract the genetic material, the RNA. We do these PCR techniques, and we actually now can, in a vat, basically make as much of the antibody as we want. We can even make little changes. How long do I want this antibody to last? Do I want it to be in the system for, let's say, 3 months, which is what we're currently doing? Or do we want it to be 6 months? So maybe in some of the studies, we can give it to high-risk people who can't make their own antibodies and protect them through that winter season. Next slide. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to neutralize this spike protein. The antibodies are going to bind to that spike protein. They're either going to block the area where it would bind to our cells, or they're going to prevent it from undergoing other changes. And they're basically going to diffuse the activity of that virus. So next slide. So as we come here to sort of the end, I just want to point out most of what I've been talking about is early upfront prevention, right? You're wearing your masks, you're avoiding exposure situations, you're washing those hands, you're getting vaccinated, and hopefully that's going to get easier and easier going forward. You also have the option of doing what President Trump did, is getting antibodies passively. You don't even have to make your own. You can get them from somebody else. And there are hotlines and access for those. But again, that's critical early things. And why do I focus on that? Because once you end up in the hospital, sure, we have certain therapies that you've heard about. We have remdesivir. Maybe it shortens your hospital stay a little, but do we have proof that it really saves lives, even though we've studied it in thousands of people? Not really overwhelming. Steroids, maybe a little bit of a mortality reduction. Anticoagulation, preventing people from having clots and other complications. That actually probably makes a difference. And we're realizing maybe needs to be extended even after a person is in the hospital. But most of what we can do is upfront, keeping people from getting very sick, keeping people from ending up in the hospital. All right, next slide. All right, so I'm going to finish there. And hopefully I've left a lot of time for people to ask questions. And I will stay around and answer.
Okay. And those of you who haven't been to Dan's website, Parasite Without Borders, it is extremely informative. And there is a section on COVID-19. And his podcast, This Week in Virology, is a phenomenal source of information as well. I'm going to start reading, and I've been depending on it for almost a year now. So let me start with questions we received, I guess, from before, and I can read them off. The first question was, which is the best vaccine to get? And I would tell you my answer would be the first one you can, but Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's the one they offer you. I was joking early on that I was going to wait for the Moderna one because that's the one that Anthony Fauci got, and the vice president got the Pfizer, so it was going to be a political thing, I think. And then I got the call, hey, we have a Pfizer shot, Dr. Griffin. I was like, I'll be right there. I did end up getting the Moderna, but I think that I would just echo that is the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, the JNJ vaccine that's coming out, really whatever vaccine you can get access to. What they really do, which is tremendous, 100%, you get that vaccine, you're not going to die of COVID. And then as far as, are you going to get the sniffles? Maybe a little bit different vaccine to vaccine, but by the time you probably get out to 7 or 8 weeks and you get the full efficacy of all the vaccines, you're probably going to see them being pretty similar. What I will say is that in the future, there probably will be quadrivalent booster shots, like we see with quadrivalent flu. So there'll be ways to keep up with changes. And so over time, you probably won't get this first generation of vaccine. There'll be future ones, but I'm going to echo what Dr. Gal says. What's the best vaccine? The one that you have the ability to get.
Okay. Somebody asked, is the second Moderna dose as effective if given after the recommended time frame of 4 weeks?
So the science is nice, and the CDC has come out on this. You can get the vaccine a few days early, just as effective. You could actually give it even a couple weeks late. The CDC has come out and said, if you're delayed out to 6 weeks, we don't see a problem with that. The science supports that. We try to stay within the window that was studied. But just reassurance. So the basic immunology over time, we just got some data from AstraZeneca on a delay of a second. They actually found if it was delayed a little bit, you actually got higher antibody responses. You got a broader antibody response. So that delay is probably not harmful. It's pretty hard to do better than 100% effective. So yeah, you're going to get a little higher antibodies if you delay just a little bit. So definitely nothing to worry about there.
Okay. Somebody asked if there was a difference in which vaccine you get depending on your medical conditions.
So at this point, there isn't. Down the road, as we learn more, might there be a little bit of selection? Like we expect, for instance, the J&J vaccine to have a little less of this reactogenicity. So certainly some people after the Pfizer and Moderna felt crummy, missed a day of work. There's a woman that I work with who is the sole caregiver of her mother, and she's been delaying getting vaccinated because, as she explained, like if I'm sick for a day, no one can take care of my mom. She may decide for that reason to get the J&J vaccine. So there will be subtle reasons why one or the other thing happens, but at this point, across the board, we're really just with what we said the first time. Whatever vaccine you can get, go ahead and get it. There really isn't a great reason to wait. As I explained to my nurse who's helping me do vaccinations all the time, by waiting for that J&J, because you might feel a little crummy for a day, you're risking getting COVID and feeling really crummy and potentially worse than that.
Okay, somebody asked, how soon after getting the vaccines can you go to a restaurant with someone in your household, and are you truly protected?
Yeah, so this is a great question because people want to know, right? Like, I got the vaccine. What do I get now? Like, what was the point? The first thing I can tell you is that, it is really great protection for you. It's a bulletproof vest. Let's talk about when that bulletproof vest really, it's gradual. You get your first shot, you get your second shot. By 2 weeks after that second shot with our current vaccines, that's when you've reached when they started to look and saw, hey, people are not dying. Your chance of even getting symptomatic is down to 95%. So I take my parents as a perfect example to answer this question. So my dad, who's turning 90 soon, he wants to go back to work. He wants to go out to a restaurant. Once he is 2 weeks past, if he wants to go to a restaurant or back to work, I'm okay with that for him going out and doing that. If he goes out with another couple and they've been vaccinated as well, they also have that. The only thing we don't know, sort of the unanswered question is, can people who start doing that, can they get the virus and transmit it to loved ones? There recently was some data out of Israel. I think that's appropriate to quote. And they said, we've seen a significant decrease in the level of virus 3 weeks after people got vaccinated. It was really in their lab going from, instead of 800,000 to 400,000. Now that's statistically significant, but they were still at levels where people are transmitting. So we don't quite know that second question. So for a person vaccinated to spend time with other people who are vaccinated, to maybe go to work, to maybe go to a restaurant, sure. But with that caveat, you still want to be careful. You still could potentially spread it to your daughter or your granddaughter or someone else you care about.
Is it recommended to get the vaccine if I have high antibody levels? I already had COVID last March.
Yeah, so we are recommending it across the board, and I'll go a little bit into details on why. Brazil, I think, is a big wake-up call where we're clearly seeing a country where a lot of people got COVID the first time. Now people are getting reinfection. So it's no longer a question of do people get reinfected. It's a question of, what is that risk relative to the time you had COVID the first time? So we think it's pretty darn low the first 3 months. By 6 months, you're about 80% less likely than someone who never got it. But as time goes by, you become more likely. And now what we're seeing is with the changes in the virus, it looks like someone who had the first, we'll say the Wuhan original strain, they may not really have much protection against these other, we'll say the South African or the Brazilian. So we're saying get that vaccine when you can. Because the last thing you want to do, right, is have a second case of COVID or have those natural antibodies, which may be part of the selection pressure that's driving the emergence of these viral changes. So be part of the solution, not the problem.
Another question. Does the vaccine have any negative effect on fertility?
I'm going to say a rumor. I'm going to really be clear about that. That was a rumor, I think, started in the anti-vax community. If you actually look at the data, more women who are vaccinated got pregnant than women not vaccinated. So my wife has to wait because I already have 3 kids and that's enough. No, I'm joking. So there's absolutely no science behind this. I think this was just another one of those, fear things put out there. First, it was going to prevent women from getting pregnant. Then it was going to prevent men from getting pregnant. The plumbing, everything's really different, by the way. Where were they coming up with a mechanism that was going to make everyone infertile? There's no science here. And as I pointed out, actually in the trials, more people who got vaccinated got pregnant than people not vaccinated. So no science. Maybe the science, a little suggestion the other way, but.
Okay. Once one is vaccinated, what risk is there for traveling by plane, and exactly what are the steps for quarantining after one returns?
Yeah, so we don't recognize vaccination status as any sort of exception or change. So if you have been vaccinated and then you are actually have an encounter, right, or you travel, you have to follow the same quarantine rules as anyone else, at least at this point. In the future, will we learn more? Will we have better ideas? Perhaps, but right now, same rules for everybody, take the same protections. You yourself, right, are protected based upon all the data we have, but can you get it and spread to others? That is still an open question.
Okay. We have what happens if the vaccine was given too low in the arm and not into the deltoid muscle?
So we certainly see that, and that's interesting. We actually see a slightly different immune reaction if it's given subcutaneous as opposed to intramuscular. With some of our other vaccines, actually the rabies, we actually see a more robust response. So there's no reason to think that it's going to be less robust. We sometimes see a little more local reactogenicity. So more of that, what I call the 7-day itch, more where it gets red and warm and someone thinks you have a skin cellulitis infection, maybe a little more lymph node swelling locally, but we're not seeing any evidence that it's going to be less effective there. So don't go get another shot. That was your shot. Move forward.
Okay, we have a question. Is the vaccine effective against the variants of the virus? For example, the British, the South African strain?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. So we know the vaccines across the board, and I think this is a really important target, look to be 100% effective at prevention of death and that really severe disease. There is a difference in the different vaccines as far as their ability to prevent mild and moderate disease. AstraZeneca, maybe not so great about the South African, right? As far as mild or moderate. We have some data on JNJ, not as good compared to the Wuhan, and it's sort of the Wuhan is the best. The UK B117 to be proper, not as effective at preventing the symptomatic disease, but still 100% preventing you from severe and death. Again, you lose a little bit when you get to the South African and the Brazilian strains, variants. But the Moderna one, the Pfizer one, we think they're quite effective. And what we've learned so far supports that they're effective. We don't have the same amount of data that we have for the other ones. So 100% across the board preventing you from death or dying, maybe a little bit less at preventing you from getting the sniffles or mild disease.
Okay, we have another question. Is there any problem with taking Tylenol before taking the shot?
No, they're really, I mean, we recommend people to go ahead, see how you do. And if you feel crummy, maybe take something afterwards. We're usually not telling people to take something just ahead of time, just to, hedge your bets. So better go ahead, get your shot, see how you're doing. If you get sore, if you have a headache, then go ahead and take the Tylenol, the ibuprofen, the Aleve. That's absolutely fine. But most people are going to do reasonably well. So you don't need to pre-medicate. And if you do start feeling not so great, we recommend then taking something.
Okay. Now I have a few questions here about children. I can answer the first one myself very easily. There is no vaccine approved for children under 16 at this time, and only the Pfizer vaccine is approved for 16 to 18-year-olds. People are asking about the time frame for vaccines for children under 16.
We should leave that with you too. So we don't know. We don't know is the proper answer. We do know that there are trials underway down to age 12, right? But what about below 12? So we know that Moderna and Pfizer are starting to look at younger ages. I haven't actually seen the J&J data, how far down they went. I did help with the recruitment for that trial, but they don't share, which is appropriate, right? We do everything the right way. No one gets any special. We are hoping maybe by summer or something, we start to get down to younger ages. But yeah, this is a challenge, right? What are we going to do come next fall if we don't have the data? So at this point, the straight answer is we do not know when it'll go down to 12, and we do not know when it'll go below the age 12.
Okay. And how can you be sure the Pfizer vaccine was properly frozen before it was administered?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. The Pfizer vaccine actually has a really sophisticated system where they have these temperature monitors and GPS locators. And so when it's delivered, it's being monitored. And once it arrives on site, it switches over to someone else who's monitoring. And then it either has to go into the freezer where there's a temperature log and monitoring there, or it can be in a normal refrigerator for about 5 days. So there's really an incredible amount of control, of sort of big brother observation, making sure this is all done properly. Because the last thing we want to do, right, is waste precious limited resources. So we've certainly heard, and I think people have seen this in the media, where whenever there's a quote unquote, we call it temperature excursion, rather than give that to a person, that stuff is all taken out of the system and replaced. And that happens pretty quickly. There's a number you call, and the CDC replaces it with another one, and there's a whole sort of backup so that happens. The last thing they want to do is create a temptation where you've got people scheduled and you use vaccine that is of unclear efficacy due to these temperature excursions.
We have another question, and that is about vaccinating people with asthma.
So I would say, yeah, no, I'd say it's definitely something we want to do. We've learned over time that certain people with certain medical problems and respiratory illnesses among those are at increased risk. So this is an ideal population to vaccinate.
And what was the people are asking about the time frame for after effects of the Pfizer vaccine? I believe they mean side effects.
Yeah, so the side effects are what we call reactogenicity. You get the shot and then your arm feels sore and you feel crummy it's usually about 24 to 48 hours. What we tell people if they feel worse past there is that you might want to go get a COVID test or get sort of evaluated to make sure you don't have something else. I just ran to a friend of mine out walking two of my dogs. And he went to an unnamed place to get his vaccine, and he was doing such a good job of keeping in his home and working remotely. But when he went to get the vaccine, he said, I was in this small room and there were all these people and I was there for hours. And then about 6 days later, I started to feel sick and he tested COVID positive. So he got his first shot, but I think it sounded like it was an exposure event, all these people there getting their shot, and a certain percent of them had COVID and he ended up. So if you have a day or two, that's the vaccine. If you start getting into day 3 or 4, then you start asking the question, ooh, is this the vaccine or something else going on?
And then there's just a couple other things that people might hear out there. What is the incidence of death in people who receive the vaccine?
So lower than people who didn't receive the vaccine. I think that's a huge issue to point out. People who've received the vaccine right now, what are we having? Thousands of people a day dying in the US of COVID. People who get the vaccine have reached full immunity. We have not seen a single death from a fully vaccinated individual. So really, really great. There was an issue at the Javits Center where actually, and I feel really bad that the way the vaccine is rolled out, here's an older individual and they finally get to the Javits Center, which is not easy to get to, even, for someone who is not in the, the older age criteria allowed to get vaccinated, actually ended up having a heart attack, not vaccine related, having a heart attack, because I think all the stress and everything of just getting to the Javits Centers is my understanding. So no, the vaccine, we have had no deaths from the vaccine, but plenty of deaths from people not able to get vaccinated and getting COVID.
Okay, and then one of the other things I hear out there and get calls about all the time is from parents, I didn't get a response when I got the shot, so it didn't work, right?
Most people get the shot and they don't even know. They don't get a response. I joked that the first one I didn't even notice. I was trying to open doors with my shoulder so it would be a little bit sore and I would think maybe I had. The second time I felt like a little bit of frustration a few hours after the shot, right after I opened an email from my partner. I'm sure it had nothing to do with the content of the email. I'm sure that was a vaccine reaction. No, I mean, most people actually feel fine after the vaccines, and that's fine. You don't have to have a big reaction. And then also one of the things I'll say from the data, if you look at it, younger people are much more likely to think it was a horrible, painful experience and they feel so crummy and have to miss work. Sort of the older people are, the less they notice the shot. So I don't know if that's the immune response or if that's something about, the wisdom that comes with years on the planet.
Okay, I think that pretty much covers all of our questions. Did you get any more, Jamie? Okay.
No.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate your time. And I would like to tell all the attendees that Dan's website and his 5-star podcast, This Week in Virology and This Week in Parasitism, are really worth listening to. Anything else you want to tell us?
No, thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity. I feel like this is one of my jobs too, is making sure I communicate as much as possible. So I always enjoy the opportunity to do that. So thank you.
Yeah, I feel lucky to have had your advice on our provider meetings and on This Week in Virology for the whole year. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Everyone take care and be safe.